let's start with a challenge. I'm going to show you some shapes, and I want you to keep your eye out for the ones that look like a house, a chimney, an arrow, a dog with his ears up, a vise, and a top hat. Just call them out when you see them. Ready? Okay, here we go. Okay, did you see those things? Did you notice anything else? Like a word? Yes, it says fly. Do you see the letters F, L, and Y in white? So you've been had. Don't worry if you didn't notice the word. Many people don't. I asked you to look for specific things, so your mind locked onto that challenge, and in doing so, locked out any other information that was available. This phenomenon of task fixation, or sometimes called lock on, lock out, is an example of what is called cognitive bias. Now, cognitive refers to thinking, and bias refers to a tendency to perceive things in a certain way, even if that way is incomplete or wrong. In this case, I tricked you into selective perception by focusing on the house, arrow, the dog, the vise, and the hat. But as you might imagine, there are many ways that your perceptions and thinking can be skewed. You're probably starting to guess that bias presents an aviation risk, as it can create unclear thinking and lead to wrong decisions. As an aviation leader, you want to be able to neutralize that risk. As Benjamin Hayden pointed out, neutralizing a bias happens when you recognize cognitive bias. So, while the last lesson was aimed at helping you develop your efficacy, this lesson is really about learning to question your thinking to make sure that it is clear and correct. The classic aviation example of task fixation is Eastern Airlines 401. They performed a controlled flight into the Florida Everglades while the entire crew focused on replacing a broken landing gear indication. This bias allowed a very experienced captain, first officer, and flight engineer, all three members of the crew, to lock on to one detail and lock out other more important ones, like the overall flight path and altitude. In our discussion of leadership, this tragic accident highlights the fact that part of a leader's job is to prioritize, direct, and focus attention to the things that need it at the time that they're needed. So Eastern Airlines 401 is really a story about a failure of leadership to prioritize, direct, and focus the attention of the crew. Okay, let's define this term cognitive bias. Remember when we talked about the process of perception, and specifically about how things like beliefs, attitudes, values, interests, and your prior knowledge can alter and change the filters that affect your perception? We talked about how when you were interested in a certain type of car, you started seeing that car everywhere that you looked. Well, that's an example of cognitive bias, very similar to the Eastern Flight 401. While your interests had you notice and lock on to certain types of things, by default, that means that your attention was not noticing or locking out other kinds of things. According to a renowned safety program specialist, bias occurs when prior knowledge or an expected outcome influences the perceptions, interpretations, and decisions we make in relation to what we are observing. So, to relate this back to our model for processing perceptions, your previous knowledge, as represented by your memories and beliefs, create unconscious filters that shape your perception. For Eastern 401, the expected outcome was the nosewheel landing gear indication coming on. This expected outcome heavily influenced the perceptions about everything else that was going on and the decisions that were made. Clearly, cognitive bias represents an error in thinking and a threat that needs to be managed. If you search for the term cognitive bias and aviation, you'll find that there are many cognitive biases that are relevant to aviation. We could easily do a whole course on cognitive bias, but right now, what I hope to impress on you is that being able to identify bias in the cockpit is a key leadership skill and threat and error countermeasure. But to get you started, we're going to focus on a few classic cognitive biases. I'm going to tell you a story about a climbing expedition to Mount Everest, which is the highest peak in the world. Now, this story does not end well, and the failure of the mission has been attributed to cognitive biases. After I tell you the story, we're going to revisit the biases that it demonstrates, and I'll ask you to find and share examples from aviation, either from incidents and accidents that you already know about, or it could be situations that you've experienced in the cockpit. So as I tell you the story, I want you to think of aviation examples that demonstrate the same biases. Are you ready? On May 10th, 1996, a group of well-paying customers and very experienced team leaders were at Camp 4 on Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world, and Camp 4 is the last camping spot that you would stop at before proceeding up to the peak at 26,000 feet. The group could see the peak from the camp, and after spending over $70,000 a person and weeks of preparation, the customers were really ready to realize the dream of hiking to the highest point on Earth. Now, just a couple of weeks before the climb, in an interview, the team leader, who, by the way, was one of the most experienced high-altitude mountain climbers, talked about a threat and error countermeasure that he used called the 2 o'clock rule. And the 2 o'clock rule was that if you could not reach the summit, the top of Mount Everest by 2 p.m., you had to turn back, because you don't want to find yourself at 26,000 feet at nighttime. You need oxygen, there's weather, and it can be terribly cold. However, on this particular trek, when they realized that they weren't going to make it to the top by 2, there was strong protest. With all the cost, the time, the money, some of the clients were saying, "I've put too much of myself into this mountain to quit now without giving it everything I've got." Oh, and it looked like a storm was coming. So some members of the team turned around and went down the mountain. But the leader and remaining customers decided to press on with the mission because they were so close, they could see the peak, and so much time and effort had already been spent. And this drive to press on, because they were so close, despite the storm, despite the fact that they were breaking the 2 o'clock rule, is known as a plan continuation bias. And if you've ever found yourself driving too fast in bad weather to get to an appointment that you're late for, then you've experienced this bias. A plan continuation bias is at work whenever you keep doing what you're doing and ignore the changing conditions, because you're so close that you underestimate the risk involved in continuing. If you suspect that you or your crew is experiencing the plan continuation bias, you should ask yourself, is our estimation of risk impaired by our will to complete our mission as planned? While 4 of the team members turned around and hiked back down the mountain, the rest of the team kept going upwards into the storm. The team leader's assessment of the storm was, "This is a big storm, but they don't usually get any worse than this." The leader had observed these storms in the past 10 years that he'd been climbing. Unfortunately, these 10 years were not normal years, and before that period, there had been several years where nobody could climb Everest because of the ferocious storms. So this bias goes by the name the recency effect. In other words, we tend to pay attention to things that we've paid attention to recently and ignore things that happened further in the past. So, a question to ask yourself is, are our assumptions about the future too focused on recent memory? Are these recent memories making us ignore other information? Despite having created this 2 o'clock rule, the team leader provides a classic example of an overconfidence bias. Here you see an actual quote, "We've got Everest figured out. I believe 100% that I'm coming back because I make all the right choices." Now, this quote is a perfect example of having too much self-efficacy. This is self-efficacy minus reality. Because A, he was human and all humans make errors. And B, we're talking about the most challenging, most unforgiving, and chaotic environment in the world. Now, this guy was the world expert in this kind of climbing, but his belief in his expertise led him to underestimate the environmental risks. It led him to underestimate how much supplemental oxygen they needed to make it back. Now, studies have shown that experts in many fields, especially medicine and aviation, can overestimate their ability to deal with certain situations. This can lead them to take risks that are outside of reasonable safety margins. If you think that you or your crew might be slipping into an overconfidence bias, you want to ask yourself, is our current assessment of our capabilities realistic? And good aviation leaders aspire to be great aviators, but continually work towards that and are able to acknowledge things that are beyond their current ability or control. As you probably guessed, this story ends in tragedy. If you'd like to learn more, just look up 1996 Everest tragedy on the internet, and you'll find documents and documentaries explaining everything. One of the most enlightening things that you'll learn is that during the pre-mission briefing, the leader actually said, "I will tolerate no disagreement up there. My word will be absolute law, beyond appeal." And while this was meant to create a clear chain of command in a very risky situation, what it really did was to discourage climbers from expressing valid concerns. Several climbers later expressed that because of this rule, and because they didn't know each other very well, they were very concerned about what others thought about them and how their performance would be judged. While many people had feelings that the group's behavior was becoming risky, the team climate did not allow people to feel safe expressing their opinions, and so they fell into a groupthink bias, which is where personal observations and concerns are suppressed and people just go along with the dominant leader's behavior, even when it is objectively reckless. Of course, there are many examples of groupthink in aviation where a first officer has sat quietly while a captain makes an error or performs a risky maneuver. Groupthink often occurs when we avoid thinking for ourselves because we don't want to be judged by our peers or by a superior, and it's just easier to stay quiet or to even convince yourself that you agree with this predominant opinion. If you suspect that you may be falling into groupthink, ask yourself, am I agreeing with this assessment or plan because I really agree with it, or because I don't want to be rejected or criticized by a peer or superior? The 4 biases that we've discussed are present in aviation and have contributed to a host of incidents and accidents. You have experienced these biases during your flight training. What countermeasures are most appropriate for these operational challenges? The challenges that you've experienced or will experience in the future.
It's the ability to handle and to avoid task saturation and how to prioritize and doing first things first and second things second and third things third. It's easy to talk about. it's hard to do. When it's you, okay, you can in a classroom say, okay, do the first things first. Okay, fine. Put folks in an airplane and give them a challenge, like a simple electrical failure, for example, or something along that line, and then give them a non-precision approach, and then give them a little bit of weather. They sort of lose sight of what's the most important thing. And of course, in the airline business, that's keeping the white side up and flying it and staying safe. So I learned that to avoid task saturation, you need to manage the tasks at hand. And I didn't realize at the time that what I was really talking about is the prioritization of threats, challenges, things you have to deal with. And that came along later. At the time, I was just trying to get people through their check rides. And interestingly enough, for failures in technical competency in the work that I did to remediate their flying, I never once taught them how to fly. I taught them how to think, and how to prioritize, and how to avoid task saturation, and how to take it sequentially and with priority. And that was my it was a powerful lessons learned that's carried over into my life.
We've started to look at a few classic cognitive biases, and hopefully you can see how these are real obstacles to clear thinking and action in aviation. As a threat and error management countermeasure, it's the responsibility of every crew member to scan for errors in judgment by asking yourself questions like, are we thinking clearly? Are we doing this for the right reason? By questioning your own thinking, you'll be able to spot bias as they happen. And it's important to say it, to communicate with the crew so that potential mistakes in thinking can be corrected as soon as possible. Remember, a bias identified is a bias neutralized. A leader's role in this process is to ensure that there's a free flow of communication that allows people to inquire when they sense something is wrong and advocate for an alternative course of action. But don't let your learning about bias stop here. Go look up cognitive bias on the internet and you'll find there's a lot of information, especially in the domain of aviation. Spotting and identifying obstacles to clear thinking is a threat and error countermeasure and a leadership skill that you can continue to build throughout your career.